Welcome to Somnia Lore, your place for peaceful, sleepy adventures. Subscribe to our channel, hit the bell icon.
Sometimes the world begins to change in ways no one notices at first. Not with a thunderclap, not with flames or war, but with something as small and fragile as a boy's wish, whispered into the silence of his own heart. Morty carried that wish quietly, the way children carry half-formed dreams. He wanted to be loved, not in the noisy way the world usually shows affection, but in the soft, steady way that feels like it will last forever. He thought about it often, in the quiet between classes, in the spaces where laughter wasn't enough to drown out his own longing, and though he never said it aloud, that wish seemed to drift outward, as if the universe was already listening. Rick noticed. He always noticed, even when he pretended not to. He had a way of catching glimpses of Morty when the boy thought himself invisible, like when Morty stared too long at the floor, or sighed just a little too heavily while pretending to be fine. Rick wasn't the type to ask about feelings, not directly, but he had his own methods. His lab was full of bottles and vials, liquids that shimmered as though they held entire galaxies in their glass walls. Some were inventions, some accidents, and some things that no one could quite explain. One of them, tonight, caught Morty's eye more than the rest. It was faintly golden, glowing like a trapped fragment of sunlight. Rick called it a potion, though the word seemed too simple for something that hummed so quietly with mystery. Morty asked what it was, his voice faltering between curiosity and hope. Rick smirked, muttered a half-answer that was neither clear nor dismissive, and left the vial where it was, knowing Morty would keep thinking about it, and Morty did. He couldn't stop. The idea that love, which had always felt so unreachable, might be caught and poured into a bottle. It was enough to make him wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could be held by the affection he longed for. The night stretched on. The world outside the garage was calm, the neighborhood settling into its usual rhythm of lights flicking off one by one, windows glowing faintly before fading into darkness. But inside, Morty's thoughts moved restlessly. He imagined what it would be like to be the center of someone's heart, to feel eyes turned toward him not in judgment or pity, but in genuine warmth. He imagined laughter shared, hands held, the weight of loneliness lifted at last. His yearning was simple, almost innocent, yet heavy enough to make his chest ache. Rick, slouched in his chair with a drink in hand, watched the boy from beneath tired eyelids. He'd seen this before, the way people chase after love as though it could fix every hollow place inside them. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that love could be a kind of madness. Still, he let the silence linger. Let Morty's imagination build upon itself, because sometimes the lesson had to be lived, not spoken. Morty touched the vial when Rick wasn't looking. It was warmer than he expected, as though it had been waiting for him all along. He thought of Jessica, her smile bright as sunlight on water, and for a moment he believed that if he could just bring this potion into the world, she would see him, not the clumsy, uncertain boy he was, but the person he wanted to be. The thought was too strong, too sweet to set aside. When Rick finally stirred, muttering about the dangers of tampering with forces that never quite behave, Morty wasn't fully listening. The warning slipped past him like mist through open fingers. All he could hear was the echo of his own longing, louder than caution, heavier than reason. Love, he thought, wasn't supposed to be complicated. Maybe, with a little help, it could be made simple. And so the choice began to take root, not as a sudden decision, but as a quiet pull, a gravity drawing Morty toward what he believed would heal him. The potion seemed almost alive in his hand, glowing faintly in the dim light of the garage, as though it knew it was part of a story larger than either of them could yet see. The air felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, and in that stillness, the boy's wish began its slow transformation into something far stranger. Outside, the stars watched silent and steady, while Morty stood at the threshold of a change he could not undo. Somewhere deep inside him, the simple desire to be loved began to stir into something that would ripple outward, reshaping not only his own world, but the fate of every soul it touched. And that, softly, is how it began. The vial had not left Morty's thoughts, not even as dawn crept in through his bedroom window, painting soft gold along the edges of his desk. He lay awake longer than he should have, the potion's glow still alive in his imagination, pulsing like a heartbeat that was not his own. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Jessica's face, gentle, unreachable, yet almost within reach now. It was as though the warmth of the potion had lodged itself beneath his skin, urging him onward, whispering that perhaps the world could finally be different. The next day carried the same rhythms as any other, yet Morty noticed the smallest details shifting. The chatter in the hallways felt more pointed, as though voices tilted toward him instead of away. A glance lingered a fraction too long. A smile stretched just a little wider in his direction. It was subtle at first, so faint that he wondered if he was only imagining it, but the feeling grew stronger as the hours passed. Something was beginning to ripple outward, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniably real. Rick had warned him. He had said the potion wasn't meant for the world, that it wasn't some neat solution to an aching heart. But Morty hadn't understood what that meant. Not fully. How could something that promised love feel dangerous? How could something so gentle carry any edge at all? The more he tried to dismiss Rick's words, the more his heart clung to the possibility that this was exactly what he needed. He wanted to believe in it, because the alternative was too heavy, the silence of longing, the ache of always being overlooked. By the time the school day ended, Morty could feel it. A current, quiet but insistent, moving through the air like the first breeze before a storm. Jessica's eyes brushed against his, and for a heartbeat he thought he saw something there. Something soft, curious, almost tender. It wasn't overwhelming yet. Not the tidal wave it would soon become, but it was enough to make Morty's chest tighten with hope. He walked home in a daze, the world shimmering as though he had stepped into a dream. Rick was waiting in the garage, tools scattered around him, expression unreadable. He glanced at Morty without lifting his head fully, as though he could already sense the change. The old man didn't ask what Morty had done. He didn't need to. Instead, he muttered under his breath about ripples and consequences, about how desire spreads faster than reason. Morty heard the words, but let them drift past, because the glow of attention he had felt that day was still clinging to him like sunlight. That evening, as shadows stretched across the quiet streets, Morty noticed the shift becoming harder to ignore. Neighbors waved with unusual warmth, their smiles too wide, their eyes lingering too long. A cashier at the corner store leaned forward as though she had known him for years. Her voice softened as if every word she spoke carried affection. Morty felt both flattered and unsettled, though he couldn't yet put the feeling into words. Love, he thought, was supposed to feel good, but this was different. Still, he told himself it was harmless. Maybe it was even what he had always needed. What was wrong with being seen, being wanted after all those years of invisibility? He tried to carry the thought like a shield, brushing away the unease that whispered at the edges of his mind. But when he caught Rick watching him from across the dinner table, eyes sharp even beneath the haze of his flask, Morty felt the smallest crack of doubt. Rick said nothing that night. He didn't stop Morty, didn't explain the science or the danger in the blunt way he usually did. Instead, he let silence do the work, letting Morty sit with the strange weight of his own choice. And in that silence, the potion's influence kept blooming, spreading softly through every corner of their world. By the time Morty lay in bed again, the night no longer felt entirely his own. The air itself seemed to lean toward him, charged with unspoken yearning. He turned beneath the covers, restless, both comforted and uneasy. He had wanted love, simple and pure. What was growing around him now felt like that wish being answered, but with a kind of intensity he hadn't expected. He thought of Jessica again, of her laugh, of the way she had once looked at someone else with effortless fondness. Tonight, though, he convinced himself it could be different. Tonight, he believed that maybe tomorrow she would look at him that way instead. He held on to that thought as his eyes grew heavy, unaware that by wishing so fiercely he had set into motion a tide that would not stop. Outside, the stars shone quietly as if they knew more than he did. The world was still, but something beneath the stillness had begun to stir. Love had taken root, and soon it would grow too wild to contain. By morning, the change was no longer something Morty had to imagine. It was there in the air, woven into the smallest details of his world. The walk to school felt different. Faces turned toward him with a softness that had never been there before. Friends who barely noticed him yesterday now lingered, their words carrying an unfamiliar warmth, their eyes holding him as though he were suddenly important. Even strangers glanced at him with an affection that made him uneasy, though he tried to push that feeling aside. He had wanted to be seen, to be loved, and now it seemed as though the universe had listened. At first it felt almost beautiful. The school hallways hummed with something gentle, like a quiet melody rising beneath the ordinary noise of lockers and footsteps. A girl he had never spoken to before brushed his shoulder and smiled as though she'd known him forever. Teachers paused mid-lesson to ask how he was doing. Their voices softened with concern that felt strangely personal. Even Jessica looked at him differently. Not yet overwhelming, but enough to spark a rush of hope through his chest. Morty carried that moment like a fragile treasure, replaying it again and again in his thoughts. But as the day unfolded, the affection began to feel heavier. Classmates leaned closer, speaking in voices that sounded more like confessions than casual words. Groups that once ignored him now wanted to sit by his side, their laughter turning too loud, their attention too focused. Everywhere he went there was a pull, a gravity that clung to him. What had begun as subtle ripples were now blooming into something more, growing faster than he could keep up with. He tried to remind himself that this was what he wanted. For so long he had dreamed of not being invisible, of having love that felt certain. And yet, as he walked home beneath the fading sunlight, the affection pressed against him like a crowd too close, like vines wrapping tighter the more he tried to move. He thought of Jessica again, and for a fleeting moment the dream returned. Her smile, her laugh, the possibility that she could truly choose him. But even that hope was shadowed by a quiet question he couldn't ignore. If everyone loved him now, what made any of it real? Rick was waiting when Morty pushed open the garage door. The old man didn't greet him with words. He just raised his eyes from a half-finished project and studied Morty, his gaze sharp in the way it always was when he already knew the answer to a question he hadn't asked. Morty shifted uncomfortably, wanting to explain, to defend himself, but no words came. Rick muttered something about flowers blooming out of season, about how beauty becomes dangerous when it grows without balance. Morty frowned, not sure what Rick meant, and left the garage with a weight pressing in his chest. That evening, the change deepened. The neighborhood, usually quiet and familiar, felt strange. Neighbors waved at him with too much fondness, their voices softening in ways that made the air heavy. Even the family dog followed him closer than usual, tail wagging, as if it too had been caught in the invisible current. Morty sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the floor, trying to convince himself this was good, that this was love, but the truth kept slipping through. Love shouldn't feel like a tide swallowing everything at once. When he closed his eyes that night, he dreamed of fields blooming under moonlight, flowers opened endlessly, too many, too fast, their petals brushing against him until he could barely breathe. They smelled sweet at first, then suffocating. He woke with a start, heart pounding, the echo of the dream clinging to him like perfume that wouldn't wash away. The world outside his window was silent, but he could feel it, the potion's reach, spreading farther with every passing hour. The next morning only confirmed it. Affection was no longer gentle, it was overwhelming. The hallways of the school, once filled with ordinary noise, now pulsed with voices all turning toward him. Jessica smiled, yes, but so did everyone else. Every glance charged with the same intensity. He couldn't escape it. The warmth he had longed for had become a fire too close, one that burned instead of comforted. Morty's chest ached, not from loneliness now, but from the weight of too much love. Love that didn't feel chosen. Love that wasn't entirely real. He thought of Rick's words again, the strange metaphor about flowers. Maybe Rick had seen this coming. Maybe Rick had always known that a wish too strong can twist itself into something unrecognizable. Morty wanted to believe it could still be fixed, that this was only a passing phase. But deep down, he felt the truth pressing against him. What he had unleashed was no longer just his own secret. It was blooming through the world, wild and unstoppable. And yet, even as unease grew inside him, part of Morty still clung to hope. Perhaps Jessica's love, if it came, would be different, truer, untouched by the chaos spreading everywhere else. He carried that fragile hope with him, even as the signs around him became harder to ignore. The potion had not just answered his wish, it had planted something in the soil of the world itself, something that was now blooming far beyond his control. The sky outside dimmed, and Morty walked home slowly, each step heavy, his heart caught between longing and dread. The night felt alive, humming with unseen energy. Every shadow seemed to lean toward him, every breath of wind seemed to whisper his name. Love had taken root, yes, but it was no longer tender. It was wild, growing too fast, stretching in directions he could not guide. Morty paused at his doorstep, staring into the quiet dark, and realized with a soft ache that his wish had become something he no longer understood. And still, the world kept blooming. Morty sat in his room for a long time, the glow of the evening slipping across the walls as though the sun itself had slowed to watch him. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong, even though everything around him seemed to insist otherwise. Everyone wanted him now. Everyone smiled at him. The attention should have felt like a dream come true, but instead it pressed against his chest until he could hardly breathe. He thought about Jessica again, about the way her laugh once carried across the classroom, about how it made his heart feel alive in a way nothing else did. Yet even her glances now felt tangled in something larger, something that didn't belong only to him. He wanted her love to be hers, to be chosen, not borrowed from a potion spell. That thought haunted him as the sky turned darker, as though the day itself had sighed into silence. When he finally crept back into the garage, Rick was still there. The old man sat slouched in his chair, tinkering with a gadget that clicked and hummed softly, though his eyes barely seemed to notice it. He looked up briefly when Morty entered, his gaze sharp but not unkind, like a doctor who already knows the diagnosis before you speak. Morty hesitated, shifting on his feet, unsure if he wanted to confess what he felt or hide it away. But Rick, without lifting his voice, broke the silence first. "You think it's love?" he muttered, almost to himself. "But it's not. It's just noise wearing love's mask." Morty flinched at the words. He wanted to protest, to defend what he had wanted for so long, but the truth of it struck too deeply. He sat across from Rick, staring at the floor, feeling like a child again, caught between his wish and the weight of its consequence. Rick didn't press him. Instead, he poured another drink, the liquid catching the dim light as though it held a piece of some other world. He sipped it slowly, then spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You know, real love doesn't chase. It doesn't cling, it chooses. That's why it hurts, Morty. Because it can say no." The words lingered, settling heavily in the room. Morty swallowed hard, unable to answer. He thought of Jessica's eyes, of the way every stranger now looked at him with that same unearned affection, and for the first time he felt the ache of how empty it all was. He wanted to cry, but the tears never came. Instead, he sat quietly, listening to the hum of the machines, the faint drip of something in the far corner, and the steady sound of Rick's breathing. After a long silence, Rick pushed the bottle aside and leaned back. His eyes, tired yet strangely gentle, rested on Morty. "I'm not mad at you," he said almost reluctantly. "You wanted something every person wants. That's not weakness. That's just being alive. But shortcuts." His voice trailed off as though he couldn't quite bring himself to finish. He gestured vaguely toward the shelves stacked with experiments. "They don't lead where you think they will." Morty nodded faintly, though the truth of it only deepened the ache inside him. He wanted to believe Rick, but the potion's pull still shimmered through the world beyond those garage doors. Tomorrow, he knew, the affection would only grow, spreading like light spilling through cracks. He felt caught between two worlds, the dream he had always wanted and the reality that warned him it could never last. Rick stood, stretching slowly, the years weighing heavy on his shoulders. He walked to one of the shelves and pulled down another vial, this one a dull gray that seemed almost lifeless compared to the golden warmth Morty had held before. He set it on the table between them, his hand lingering on the glass. "This one's different," Rick said. "Not a cure, not really. More like a counterbalance. But it won't fix the root, Morty. Nothing can fix the root but time and choice." Morty stared at the vial, his heart caught between longing and dread. He wanted to reach for it, to undo what he had done, but the thought of letting go of the love, however false, terrified him. He didn't know if he could return to being invisible, to being unseen. Rick didn't push. He just let the silence deepen, as though he understood that some decisions couldn't be rushed. The night grew later. The garage lights buzzed softly, casting long shadows across the floor. Morty leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of his own heart. He thought about the world outside, about Jessica, about the neighbors, and classmates who would wake tomorrow with even stronger affection. He thought about how quickly dreams could turn heavy, how quickly a wish could turn into something that trapped you. Rick finally spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost tender. "You're not alone in this, Morty. Even if it feels like you are. Remember that." Morty looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time he saw through the layers of sarcasm and indifference. Rick cared, maybe not in the way Morty wanted, maybe not with warmth that was easy to hold, but it was there, steady as a flame that refused to die. It was messy, imperfect, but it was real. And that Morty realized mattered more than the endless flood of false affection waiting for him outside. The boy exhaled slowly, his chest easing for the first time all day. He didn't have the answers, not yet, but sitting there in the quiet with Rick, he felt something steadier than the noise of the potion's spell. He felt seen, not by magic, not by illusion, but by someone who knew his flaws and stayed anyway. It wasn't everything he had wished for, but maybe it was enough for now. The night carried on, soft and unbroken, wrapping around them like a blanket, and somewhere beyond the walls of the garage, the world kept blooming, wild and unstoppable, waiting for the morning. Morning arrived heavy, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Morty woke with the uneasy memory of Rick's words lingering in his mind, echoing faintly in the silence of his room. For a moment he thought, maybe it had all been a dream. The strange warmth in people's eyes, the way strangers leaned toward him as if drawn by some invisible thread. But when he stepped outside, the truth pressed against him with undeniable force. The change was no longer subtle. It had grown overnight, stretching its roots deeper into every corner of the world. On the walk to school, Morty felt the air brimming with an energy, that made his skin prickle. Neighbors waved too eagerly, their greetings spilling over into declarations of affection that felt rehearsed yet desperate. A mailman stopped in his tracks, staring at Morty with wide, adoring eyes as though delivering letters no longer mattered. Even the birds seemed to pause in their flight, their calls sweeter, stranger, as if they too had been caught in the potion's bloom. Morty kept his head down, heart pounding, but the affection pressed closer with every step, crowding him until he wished he could vanish. By the time he reached school, the hallways had transformed into something surreal. Students crowded around him in clusters, their words melting into a chorus of admiration. Some reached for his arm, others leaned in too close, and all of them carried the same shining intensity in their gaze. Morty stumbled through the crowd, overwhelmed by the tidal wave of attention. What once had been a quiet longing had now become unbearable. He wanted to shout, to beg them to stop, but the affection only grew louder, as though the very walls pulsed with it. Jessica was there too, standing at the edge of the crowd. For a heartbeat, Morty felt the old dream flicker. The hope that maybe, just maybe, her love would be different. But when her eyes met his, they glowed with the same unnatural devotion that filled everyone else's. The tenderness he had wanted, the choice he had longed for, was gone. What stared back at him wasn't Jessica's heart. It was the potion's spell, alive in her as it was in all of them. Morty's chest tightened, the weight of realization pressing down like stone. He ran, pushing through the hallways, slipping past hands that reached for him. Morty fled the building, his breaths ragged. The outside air felt no different. The love followed him, spilling out of every voice, every glance, every gesture. Even passing cars slowed. Drivers leaning from windows with smiles that looked too wide, too bright. He couldn't escape it. It was everywhere, a flood rising higher with each moment. By the time he burst into the garage, his legs trembling, Rick was waiting. He didn't look surprised. He rarely did. Instead, he leaned against the workbench, arms folded, eyes steady as Morty collapsed into a chair, gasping for air. They're all, Morty stammered, unable to finish. Rick's voice was calm, almost too calm. Yeah, that's how it spreads. Affection without boundaries. Love without choice. It's not really love at all. It's just hunger in disguise. Morty pressed his hands to his face, the noise of the world still echoing inside his head. I thought it would make things better. I just wanted her to notice me. I didn't want this. Rick sighed, the sound weary but not unkind. He walked over to the shelf, pulling down another vial, this one swirling with a strange, stormy color. He set it beside Morty without explanation. The boy stared at it, uncertain, afraid. This won't stop it, Rick admitted. Not completely, but it might slow it down, buy us time. Morty looked at him, desperate for answers. What do we do? How do we fix it? Rick's gaze softened, though his voice stayed firm. There's no easy fix, Morty. You can't force balance any more than you can force love. You can only hold it back for a while. Try to guide it, until it burns itself out, but it's gonna hurt. That's the cost. The words settled over Morty like a weight he couldn't shake. He thought again of Jessica, of her laugh that had once felt like sunlight. Now, even if she looked at him, he would never know if it was her or the potion speaking. The thought hollowed him out, leaving him both angry and heartbroken. He wanted to undo it all, to go back to before. But time doesn't turn backward. Wishes, once spoken into the world, live on in ways no one can control. Rick placed a hand briefly on Morty's shoulder. The gesture was small, almost rough, but steady. It grounded him more than all the affection pouring in from the outside world. For the first time, Morty realized that the only love that still felt real was the kind that didn't shout, didn't cling, didn't demand. It was imperfect, messy, and hidden beneath layers of gruffness, but it was Rick's, and it was enough to remind him he wasn't entirely alone. The garage grew quiet, save for the faint hum of machines and the distant murmur of voices beyond the walls, voices that still called his name, still reached for him with hands unseen. The world outside was blooming too fast, a garden gone wild, and Morty knew it was only the beginning. Rick lifted the storm-colored vial, holding it to the light. We'll try this, he said. But don't fool yourself, Morty. This isn't about fixing them. It's about facing yourself. That's the part that matters. Morty swallowed hard, the truth of it sinking deep. He nodded slowly, though his heart still ached. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the ground. The air felt heavier, thick with a love that was no longer tender but consuming. Morty sat there, caught between fear and hope, knowing the night ahead would only bring more. And still, beyond the garage doors, the world kept blooming, wild and unstoppable. its roots stretching farther than either of them could yet see. Night descended like a weight over the Smith household, though it was not the comforting dark Morty had once known. The shadows seemed alive, restless, whispering in time with the voices that never stopped outside. Even as he sat at the kitchen table trying to eat the food his mom had set down, Morty felt eyes on him. Through the windows, faint silhouettes lingered at the edge of the lawn, their shapes swaying like trees in the wind. Neighbors who once passed by without notice now stood unmoving, their gazes fixed on him with quiet devotion. The food turned to ash in his mouth. Rick entered with his usual slouch, a bottle clutched in one hand and the storm-colored vial in the other. His eyes, bloodshot yet sharp, scanned the room before settling on Morty. There was no lecture. This time, no ridicule. Only silence heavy enough to rival the one pressing against the house. Rick set the vial on the table between them, its shifting colors flickering like a contained storm. Morty stared at it, his reflection warped in the glass. He knew what it meant, that this was their only chance to hold back the tide, but a question gnawed at him. Would it change anything, or simply layer one mistake on top of another? He remembered Jessica's gaze in the hallway, empty of choice, and the thought stung more than anything. What was the point of love if it wasn't real? Rick lit a cigarette, the smoke curling lazily in the dim kitchen light. "We release it tonight," he said simply. Before things spread beyond the point of no return, the words sent a chill down Morty's spine. He glanced again at the window, where shadows shifted closer, a murmur rising faintly like a prayer. "It already feels like it's too late," Morty whispered, his voice thin. Rick exhaled smoke, eyes narrowing. "It's never too late to try, Morty, but don't mistake effort for control. You can fight the flood, but you don't get to decide how much gets washed away." That night, under the cover of darkness, they moved. Rick carried the vial in a lid-lined case, muttering calculations under his breath, while Morty trailed close behind. The streets were lined with people, neighbors, classmates, strangers, all standing in eerie stillness, their faces turned toward Morty with an unblinking reverence. Their presence was suffocating, yet none reached out. It was as if they were waiting, patient as statues, for some unspoken command. They reached the edge of town, where a half-abandoned park stretched wide beneath the stars. Rick set the case down on a rusted picnic table, opening it with practiced care. The vial glowed faintly, its colors writhing like trapped lightning. Morty watched, heart hammering, as Rick prepared the device that would release it into the air. "Once this spreads," Rick murmured, "it'll counteract the potion's pull, not cure it. Don't get your hopes up, but dampen it, slow the burn. People might drift back into themselves." Morty's hands trembled, and if it doesn't... Rick's eyes flicked to him, sharp and unyielding. "Then you live with what you unleashed. That's all any of us ever do." The words cut deep, but Morty nodded. Together, they set the device, Rick guiding him step by step. When the final latch snapped into place, the air itself seemed to pause. Morty's fingers hovered above the release, his body shaking with the weight of choice. "Do it," Rick said, voice steady. Morty pressed down. The device hissed, and the vial shattered within, releasing a plume of shimmering mist that rose into the sky. The storm-colored haze spread, curling through the park, drifting into the streets, dissolving into the night. Morty held his breath, as the world seemed to shift. For a moment there was silence, then faintly a change. The murmurs of the watching crowd softened, their rigid postures slackening. Some blinked as though waking from a dream, confusion etching across their features. A woman stumbled backward, clutching her chest, her eyes wet with something human again. A man turned away, muttering in disoriented fear. The tide was receding, slowly, unevenly, but it was happening. Morty's chest swelled with a fragile hope, but it shattered as quickly as it came. Not all were freed. Many still stared, their devotion undimmed, their voices rising louder now, as if resisting the pull of the antidote. The two halves of the crowd clashed, those awakening with fear and those still lost in devotion, chaos rippling outward. Rick grabbed Morty's arm, pulling him back. "See? No clean endings, just messes shifting into new shapes." They ran, weaving through the splintering crowd. Morty's heart pounded as he caught glimpses of familiar faces, friends, teachers, neighbors, some breaking free, others consumed deeper by obsession. The air buzzed with conflict, a strange mix of sobs, shouts, and chants that blurred into something almost inhuman. When they finally reached the garage again, Morty collapsed into a chair, his body trembling. "It's worse," he whispered, guilt choking him. "Now they're fighting each other. I made it worse." Rick leaned against the bench, watching him with a quiet intensity. "You made it real, Morty. That's what happens when you mess with choice. You pulled the thread and now the whole thing's unraveling." "That's not worse. It's just truth. Morty buried his face in his hands, tears stinging his eyes. The sound of chaos still echoed faintly from beyond the walls, a reminder that the world outside had changed forever. And deep down, he knew Rick was right. The potion hadn't just bent others, it had exposed something in himself, something desperate and fragile that could never be put back the same way. He poured himself a drink, the glass clinking softly. Get some rest, Morty. Tomorrow's not going to wait for you to feel ready. But Morty didn't move. He sat there in the quiet, the storm inside him louder than the one outside, and wondered how long it would take before he could look at Jessica or anyone else and believe in what was real again. The night stretched on, heavy and unbroken, carrying with it the sound of a world reshaped by a choice too small to take back. The garage was dim, its hum of machines muted, as though even the walls were weary of the world outside. Morty sat slumped in his chair, his eyes swollen from the tears he had refused to admit. The silence between him and Rick heavy but not hostile. Outside, faint echoes drifted in through the cracks. The strange chorus of a fractured neighborhood, voices raised in confusion, others still lost in blind devotion. Morty tried to imagine the faces behind those sounds. The neighbor who used to mow his lawn with a friendly wave. The girl in his math class who doodled in her notebook. The man at the corner store who always slipped him an extra candy bar. They were no longer just people in the background. They had become unwilling actors in a story Morty himself had written, though he never meant to hold the pen. Rick busied himself at the workbench, tools clinking softly, the glow of strange devices casting shifting shadows across his face. He didn't speak, and that silence pressed harder on Morty than any scolding could. It was as though Rick was waiting for him to name the truth himself. And Morty, though his lips trembled with words, could only whisper them inside. I wanted love, and now the world is breaking because of it. When dawn finally touched the sky, pale and uncertain, the two of them stepped outside. The streets bore the marks of the night. Some homes had broken windows, doors left hanging ajar. As families fled in confusion, neighbors argued on lawns, their voices sharp with disbelief, while others still trailed behind Morty at a distance, eyes glazed with unwavering devotion. It was a patchwork of two realities colliding in the same space, half the world blinking awake, half still dreaming. Morty's steps faltered as he passed a group of children near the playground. They stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes, their hands clutching flowers plucked from nearby gardens. One stepped forward, a girl with tangled hair, and placed the blossoms at his feet as if he were something holy. Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to scream that he wasn't special, that he wasn't worthy of this strange, broken worship, but his throat closed before the words could escape. Rick pulled him away, muttering under his breath, "This is what happens when you tamper with choice, Morty. Some will come back to themselves, but others, they'll cling tighter to the lie because it's easier than facing what's real." The words rattled in Morty's mind as they walked further, the sun climbing higher yet unable to warm the chill in his chest. He thought of Jessica somewhere in the chaos. Was she free now? Or did she still see him through that veil of false devotion? The question gnawed at him, sharp and relentless. By afternoon, the streets had quieted, though not in peace. Those who had awakened carried fear in their eyes, whispering to each other about what had happened, what it meant, and who was to blame. More than once, Morty felt their stares turned toward him, not with worship, but with suspicion. If the devoted saw him as savior, the freed saw him as the storm. That weight pressed heavier than he could bear. They returned to the garage, and Morty sank onto the couch, his body trembling with exhaustion. Rick poured himself another drink, sitting across from him in rare stillness. For a long moment, there was no sound, but the faint ticking of a clock. Then Rick spoke, his tone stripped of sarcasm. "You think love is soft, Morty? But it's not. Love is sharp. It cuts, it scars, and sometimes it takes more than it gives. What you did, it wasn't about love. It was about wanting control over it." Morty flinched, his eyes burning. I didn't want to feel invisible anymore." Rick leaned forward, his gaze piercing. "And now the whole world sees you. Is it better?" Morty had no answer. His chest tightened until he thought he might shatter. He pressed his palms into his eyes, wishing he could erase the last few days, rewind to before the potion, before the choice. But time only moved forward, dragging him with it. That night as Morty tried to sleep, the images replayed in his mind, the flowers at his feet, the broken windows, the way people's voices had splintered into love and fear. His dreams bled into reality, and when he opened his eyes again, he wasn't sure which world he had woken into. The faint sound of footsteps outside told him he wasn't alone. He crept to the window. A small crowd had gathered in the street, some holding candles, others simply staring up at the house. Their voices rose in a low hum, a chant Morty couldn't quite make out but which seemed to carry his name like a ghost on the wind. His knees weakened, and he stumbled back, Rick appeared in the doorway, watching without surprise. They won't stop, Morty. Not until you learn the one thing they're really waiting for. Morty's voice broke. What's that? Rick lit a cigarette, the flame flickering in the dark. For you to stop running from yourself. The words lingered long after Rick left the room, settling over Morty like a riddle he wasn't ready to solve. But deep inside, he knew the chaos outside was only the surface of something deeper, something in him that had to be faced before the world could quiet again. The night pressed close, the chant of voices seeping through the walls, and Morty lay awake, torn between guilt and yearning, between fear of what he had done and the fragile hope that maybe somehow there was still a way to make it right. And so, in the silence before dawn, with the weight of countless eyes upon him, Morty understood. This was no longer about Jessica, or about being loved. It was about learning who he was when all the false lights fell away. The night outside thickened, not just in darkness, but in presence, as though the air itself leaned closer, listening. Morty lay awake, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet sleep stayed far from him. Every time his eyelids fluttered shut, the low hum of voices outside pulled him back, each chant carrying his name like a soft rope tugging him toward the window. He sat up, his room dim, except for the pale glow of the streetlight bleeding through the blinds. The shadows moved slowly, shapes of neighbors, classmates, strangers, all standing together with an eerie patience, their devotion steady as a heartbeat. Morty pressed his palms against the glass, his breath fogging the window. Some lifted their heads as though they could feel his gaze, their eyes wide, their faces serene. A woman he recognized, his math teacher, raised a candle high, her lips moving in a whisper he could not hear. The sound was too faint, but the rhythm was unmistakable. It was not a name anymore. It was a plea. Morty's chest tightened. He stumbled back from the windows, heart thudding in his ears. His room felt smaller than ever, the air heavier. Downstairs he heard the faint shuffle of Rick moving about, his muttered words carrying the weary tone of someone too used to cleaning up after impossible mistakes. Morty wanted to call out, to tell him what he saw, but the words caught in his throat. Somehow this felt like something he had to face alone. The following morning was no gentler. The street seemed quieter at first glance. The crowd dispersed into smaller groups, yet their presence lingered everywhere. Some stood at corners, watching him silently as he walked to school. Others followed at a distance, never too close, but never letting him forget their eyes. It was no longer just worship. It was something more unsettling. A bond that twisted tighter the longer it stretched. Morty kept his head down, trying to focus on the cracks in the pavement, but the weight of those gazes pressed on him like an invisible chain. At school, the hallways buzzed with unease. Some kids whispered in confusion about what had happened over the past nights, about the strange gatherings, about how people seemed different. Others looked at Morty with suspicion, their stares sharp like blades searching for someone to blame. He caught snippets of words, him, potion. Not normal, but he kept walking, his body tense, his voice trapped in silence. Then suddenly he saw her. Jessica stood by her locker, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Morty's world narrowed, his chest filling with hope and dread all at once. Was she free now? Or was she still caught in the pull of what he had done? Their eyes met briefly, and in that glance, Morty saw both recognition and distance. It wasn't devotion. Not anymore, but it wasn't warmth either. She looked at him as though trying to remember who he really was, as if she wasn't sure whether the boy before her was the one she used to smile at, or the figure whispered about in strange midnight chants. Then she turned away, her hair falling across her face, leaving Morty with nothing but silence. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Lessons drifted by unheard, voices around him muffled and distant. When the final bell rang, Morty walked home slowly, his feet dragging. The sky was heavy with clouds, the air charged as if waiting for a storm. By the time he reached the garage, Rick was already waiting, hunched over a new device that sparked faintly with blue light. "You've noticed it too," Rick said without looking up. "The devotion's changing. It's not just blind love anymore. It's evolving. They want something from you now, Morty. Something you don't even understand yet." Morty sank onto a stool, his voice shaking. "What do they want from me? I didn't mean for any of this. I just wanted..." His words broke and he pressed his fists against his knees. "I just wanted to be seen." Rick finally looked up, his expression sharp, almost pitying. "And now you are. Every choice you make, every word you say, it's not just yours anymore. They've tied themselves to you, Morty. You're not just a kid who wanted love. You're their symbol now. And symbols, they don't get to rest." Morty felt the truth of it in his bones. He thought of the girl at the playground with flowers, of the crowd outside his house, of Jessica's distant eyes. They weren't just looking at him. They were waiting for something only he could give. But what? He didn't know, and the not knowing was worse than anything. That night, the crowd returned, larger than before. Morty stood at his window again, his breath shallow, their chants rose in waves, no longer fragmented whispers, but a unified sound that throbbed in the air. It was almost beautiful in its rhythm, almost soothing, yet it carried a weight that pressed against his chest. They weren't calling his name anymore. They were asking for him, for his voice, his choice, his guidance. They were asking him to step into something far bigger than himself. Morty closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks. He didn't want this. He didn't want to be worshipped, didn't want to be feared, didn't want to be anything but a boy who dreamed of being loved. But the world doesn't return what it takes so easily. Behind him, Rick's voice broke the silence. You can't stay silent forever, Morty. If you don't give them something, they'll make their own meaning out of you. And trust me, you won't like what they decide. Morty turned, his face pale. But what if I say the wrong thing? Rick sighed, his cigarette glowing faintly in the dark. You already did, Morty. That's how we got here. But sometimes the wrong thing spoken honestly is better than silence. The words sank into Morty like stones, heavy and unmovable. He stood there for a long time, torn between the weight of his guilt and the strange, fragile spark of responsibility that had begun to glow within him. The chants outside swelled, filling the night, and Morty knew the moment was coming when he would have to step into the world and face what he had created. Not as a boy chasing love, but as someone who could no longer escape the eyes of those who waited. And though fear gripped him, another truth stirred quietly beneath it. Perhaps love was never about being seen. It was about choosing to see others, even when it broke you. The chants outside rose and fell like waves against the shore, steady, relentless, impossible to ignore. Morty stood frozen in his room, his fists clenched at his sides, the sound pressing into his chest until it felt like his ribs might crack. His name no longer echoed in their voices. Instead, it was something deeper, more desperate, as though they were asking for a piece of him he didn't know how to give. Each voice braided with the next, creating a current too strong to resist. He had never wanted to lead anyone. He had only wanted to be loved. And yet here he was, standing at the edge of a crowd that saw him as more than human. Rick leaned in the doorway, his cigarette glowing like a single tired star in the dark. His eyes, half-shadowed, followed Morty with an expression that was neither mocking nor gentle, but something in between. You can't just keep staring at the floor, Morty. They're not going to vanish because you hide from them. You've got two choices. You either speak, or you let them decide what you are without your voice in the mix. Morty swallowed hard, his throat dry. The thought of stepping outside, of facing hundreds of eyes all waiting for him, felt unbearable. But so did the thought of silence, of letting his absence shape him into something he wasn't. He remembered Jessica's gaze in the hallway, how distant she had seemed, as though trying to puzzle out who he was now. If even she didn't know anymore, maybe it was time for him to show someone, anyone, the truth, even if it broke him. His steps down the stairs felt heavier than they should, each one echoing like a drumbeat. When he reached the front door, his hand hovered over the knob, trembling. Beyond the wood, the hum of voices pulsed like a heartbeat, urging him forward. He glanced back at Rick, who stood a few feet behind, arms crossed, watching without interference. There was no safety net here. It was Morty's step to take. He opened the door. The night air rushed in, cool and sharp, carrying with it the scent of wax and smoke from the candles scattered across the street. The crowd stood in silence as the door creaked open, their chants collapsing into a stillness so absolute it felt like the entire world held its breath. Faces turned upward, eyes wide and shining in the dim light, each one fixed on him as though nothing else existed. The sheer weight of their expectation nearly sent Morty stumbling back inside, but something stronger, something quieter kept him rooted. He stepped forward onto the porch. The boards creaked under his weight, but no one moved, no one spoke. Their silence was louder than any chant. Morty's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his mind blank, his heart screaming. He wanted to tell them to go home, to leave him alone, but the words felt too small for the enormity of what had grown here. He wanted to beg for forgiveness, but even that felt hollow, a bandage too flimsy for the wound he had made. So instead, he let his truth slip out in the only way he could. His voice shook, but it carried. I didn't mean for this to happen. The words floated into the night, fragile yet undeniable. A ripple passed through the crowd, some faces softening, others tightening in confusion. Morty swallowed, his throat raw. I just wanted to feel like I mattered. I thought if someone loved me, it would fix everything. But it didn't. It broke things. And now you're all standing here, waiting for me. And I don't know what you want. I don't even know what I want anymore. For a long moment, the silence pressed back against him, but it was different now, less expectant, more uncertain. Some lowered their candles. Others shifted uncomfortably as though awakening from a dream they weren't sure they had chosen. Morty's eyes scanned the crowd, and for the first time, he didn't just see devotion. He saw confusion, pain, fear. He saw people. Something loosened in his chest. He spoke again, softer but steadier. I can't be what you think I am. I'm just me. A kid who made a mistake. I don't deserve worship, or chants, or flowers at my door. I don't deserve any of this. But if there's anything I can give you, it's the truth. And the truth is, I can't fix you. I can only try to fix myself. The words hung in the air, trembling between them and the crowd. Some faces broke, tears streaming as though his confession unlocked their own buried grief. Others turned away, muttering, shaking their heads. A few still stared, their devotion unshaken but quieter now, like embers instead of flames. Rick watched from the doorway, exhaling smoke into the night. His eyes glinted faintly, unreadable, but there was no mockery in his silence. For once he let Morty stand alone, let the boy's voice carry without interruption. The crowd began to shift. Some drifted back into the shadows, their candles dimming one by one. Others lingered, hesitant, torn between awakening and clinging to the dream. Morty stood on the porch until his legs ached, watching them scatter, dissolve, reform in smaller clusters. It wasn't an ending. It wasn't even close. But it was a beginning of something different. When the last of the voices faded into the distance, Morty sank to the porch steps, his body trembling with exhaustion. Rick joined him, sitting beside him without a word, the smoke from his cigarette curling upward into the night. For a while they sat in silence, the quiet heavier but gentler than the one before. Finally Rick spoke, his voice low. Not bad, Morty. You didn't fix it, but you didn't run either. That's more than most people manage. Morty stared at his hands, the faint glow of candle wax still lingering in his memory. It doesn't feel like enough. Rick shrugged, his eyes distant. It never does. That's the curse of being honest. Morty leaned back against the step, his eyes drifting to the stars above. They seemed smaller tonight, farther away, yet still steady, still burning. For the first time, he let himself breathe, without waiting for the next wave of chance. The next shadow at the window. The night was not healed, but it was bearable. And maybe for now, that was enough. The porch steps were still warm beneath Morty, as though the wood had absorbed the weight of everything that had just unfolded. The street had emptied of candles. Their wax dripped and hardened into crooked trails along the pavement. Silence lingered like smoke, but it wasn't absolute anymore. It was fractured, unsettled, buzzing faintly with the things left unsaid. Morty sat slumped forward, his elbows digging into his knees, the weight of exhaustion dragging at him more than any chant ever had. He had spoken, finally, but instead of relief, there was only a hollow ache in his chest. Rick hadn't moved for a while. He sat a step higher, cigarette balanced between his fingers, the glow fading with each exhale. His silence wasn't indifferent, it was deliberate, a rare gift of space. Morty sensed it but couldn't appreciate it. His mind churned restlessly, replaying every word he'd said, wondering which ones had landed, which ones had shattered. When Rick finally broke the quiet, his voice was low, almost weary. You know, Morty, people don't just let go of an idea like that overnight. Some of them walked away. Yeah, but some of them didn't. The ones who stayed, they're the dangerous kind. Devotion doesn't burn out, it mutates. Morty's stomach twisted. He hadn't thought about that, hadn't wanted to. He had imagined stupidly that honesty might scatter them all, send them back to their lives, free him from their suffocating gaze. But Rick was right. He had seen it in the lingering faces, eyes that refused to dim, that clung to him not despite his confession, but because of it. They'll think you're testing them, Rick went on, flicking ash into the dark. Or worse, that you're suffering for them. And suffering, Morty, that's rocket fuel for true believers. Congratulations, you just gave them a new reason to worship. Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to scream, to insist it wasn't fair, that he had told them the truth, and that should have been enough. But the memory of those eyes, wet with tears, yet burning with something sharper, silenced him. He couldn't deny what Rick saw clearer than he ever could. The night deepened, the street lamp buzzing faintly overhead. Morty pushed himself to his feet, unable to sit still under the weight of his thoughts. So what do I do? Just keep talking, keep telling them I'm nothing, that I'm not who they think I am. Rick's smirk was tired, almost bitter. You think the truth is a cure, Morty? It's not. It's a mirror. Some people will look at it and see themselves. Others will smash it because they hate what it shows. Either way, you don't control what they see. Morty turned away, pacing the porch, the boards creaking under his sneakers. His heart hammered as though he hadn't just poured it out hours earlier. He had wanted to end it, to tear down the altar they built out of his mistakes. But instead he had fed it. The thought left him dizzy, his stomach hollow. The following day confirmed Rick's warning. Morty had barely dragged himself out of bed, his eyes raw from sleeplessness, when he heard voices outside again. Not the thunderous chants of the night before, quieter, more deliberate, almost reverent. When he peered through the blinds, his chest dropped. A handful of people knelt in the street, heads bowed, their hands pressed together. No candles this time, no flowers, just silence and stillness. Their faces turned up toward his window like sunflowers tracking the light. They weren't chanting his name anymore. They were waiting. Morty stumbled back from the window, his breath shallow. "They're still here," he whispered, more to himself than to Rick. Rick, sprawled on the couch with a bottle in hand, barely looked up. "Told you. It's not a phase, Morty. It's not a crush they can shake off. You peeled back the curtain, and now they think you're bleeding for them. You're a martyr they can touch." Morty pressed his hands into his face, dragging them down until his skin burned. He wanted to deny it, to run outside and scream until they scattered, but some part of him knew it wouldn't matter. The more he fought, the more they would cling. He wasn't their savior, he was their wound, and they needed him to keep it open. By evening, the small gathering had doubled. Whispers rose and fell like prayers, their voices weaving through the air in tones too soft to be threatening, but too steady to ignore. Morty couldn't eat, couldn't think. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, kneeling, waiting, as if his very existence demanded an answer. Jessica's face drifted into his thoughts again, unbidden. He remembered the distance in her eyes, the way she had looked at him as though searching for something that wasn't there anymore. Was she out there now, among them, watching him, not as the boy fumbling for her attention, but as the figure they all believed in? The thought twisted his gut, a knife turning slow. Rick finally broke the tension, his voice sharper now. "You've got two roads, Morty. You either disappear, vanish off the grid, let time choke this thing out, or you take the reins. You steer it before it eats you alive." The words lodged in Morty's chest. Disappear? Where would he go? How could he ever run far enough to escape the weight of their eyes? And the other option, the thought of leading them, even for the sake of control, filled him with a terror he couldn't name. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't even sure he was himself anymore. But the third option, the one Rick hadn't spoken aloud, gnawed at him. Do nothing. Stay frozen. Let the tide rise higher and higher until it drowned him completely. Morty realized with a sick certainty that if he chose that, it wouldn't just drown him, it would pull everyone else under too. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of whispers seeping through his window, Morty understood something he had never wanted to admit. This wasn't going away. It wasn't fading. It was growing, changing shape, becoming something more dangerous than chants or candles. And no matter what he did, he was at the center of it. Sleep didn't come, only the sound of whispers, patient and endless, rising and falling like the tide. Morty woke with the uneasy weight of silence pressing against his chest. It wasn't real silence, not entirely. Outside his window, the faint murmur of voices continued, the same measured rhythm he had heard the night before. They never shouted, never broke into frenzy. They whispered, patient, reverent, tireless. He lay there in the dim half-light of dawn, staring at the ceiling, knowing that when he finally forced himself to look, the faces would still be there. Dragging himself out of bed felt like dragging through mud. His body ached, not from any injury, but from the sheer heaviness of being watched. When he shuffled to the window and tugged at the blinds, the sight made his stomach twist. The crowd had grown again, not in thousands, but enough to remind him that the tide was still rising. They weren't holding candles anymore, nor carrying offerings. They were simply present, kneeling, waiting, their heads tilted slightly upward, as though his very existence was a sermon. Morty let the blinds snap shut and pressed his back to the wall, trying to slow his breathing. It felt like he was losing territory in his own life. Inch by inch, his bed was no longer a place of rest. His window no longer a simple view of the street. Every corner of his world was being carved away by the weight of their devotion. Rick was already awake, sitting at the kitchen table with a half-empty bottle and a look that was more calculating than tired. He didn't even glance up when Morty shuffled in. "They're still out there," Rick muttered as though it wasn't obvious. "They're not tourists, Morty. They're settlers, and once settlers put down roots, they don't leave." Morty sank into a chair, his fingers twitching against the wood. What do they want from me? I told them. I told them I'm nothing. Why won't they believe me? Rick finally met his gaze, eyes sharp but heavy. Because nothing is harder to believe than the truth, Morty. They want meaning. They'll twist you into it, no matter what you say. You're not fighting logic, you're fighting hunger. And hunger doesn't care if the food is real. The words clung to Morty like shadows. He thought of Jessica again, though he hadn't seen her face among the crowd. He remembered her expression from that night, the searching, the distance. He wondered if she had found her way into this quiet congregation, or if she had finally walked away. Either answer hurt. Later that day, Morty tried to leave the house. He thought if he walked past them, if he just kept going, they might scatter, realize how absurd it was to sit in the street for a boy who barely knew himself. But the moment he opened the door, every head lifted in unison. The silence thickened, became something alive, pressing against him as if the air itself leaned closer. He froze on the porch. No one spoke, no one reached out. They simply looked at him, eyes wide, breaths held as though his next step carried the weight of prophecy. Morty's throat went dry. He couldn't walk past them. He couldn't even move. He closed the door again, the sound echoing like finality. Rick's voice drifted from the living room. Told you, they're not here for your words, Morty. They're here for your presence. You could stand there and sneeze, and they'd call it a blessing. The thought made Morty sick. He felt like a prisoner inside his own skin, every twitch and breath magnified by their eyes. Days bled together in this rhythm. The whispers outside, his restless pacing, Rick's sardonic commentary that cut sharper than silence. The world beyond the crowd began to feel distant, almost unreal, as though his life had shrunk to the dimensions of his house and the stretch of pavement filled with waiting bodies. But then something changed. One evening, just as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in bruised oranges and purples, a voice rose from the crowd. Not a chant, something gentler. A song, a low hum at first. One person daring to break the silence, then another joined, then another, until the street swelled with melody. It wasn't words Morty could understand, but the sound was haunting, almost beautiful, like a lullaby carried on the wind. Morty pressed his forehead to the window pane, his chest tight. For a moment against his will, he felt pulled into it, into the aching harmony of their belief, into the warmth of a community he hadn't asked for but couldn't escape. It scared him, how easily it almost felt like comfort. Rick stood behind him, his voice low but steady. Careful, Morty. That's how it starts. You start to believe the song was written for you. You start to think maybe you owe them something. But the truth is, you don't. You never will. Morty wanted to believe him, but the song lingered soft and insistent, threading itself into the cracks of his doubt. He lay awake that night, the melody replaying in his mind, wrapping around him like a chain disguised as a blanket. He wondered if this was how it would always be. Not flames, not fury, but devotion, so steady it eroded him grain by grain. And when he finally closed his eyes, drifting on the edge of sleep, Morty realized something that made his stomach twist even deeper. The crowd wasn't waiting for him to speak anymore. They were waiting for him to surrender. Morty lay in bed, staring into the dimness that bled from the street lamp through his blinds. The song still hovered in the air, faint even after it had ended, as if silence itself remembered the melody. He couldn't push it away. It pressed into him with a strange tenderness, both terrifying and soothing. He hated that part of him, wanted to lean into it, to imagine he belonged to something bigger than himself. But every time the thought flickered, another part of him recoiled, afraid that by surrendering, he'd lose whatever was left of the boy he used to be. Morning came without rest. Morty dragged himself out of bed and into the kitchen, his movements sluggish, his chest heavy. Rick was at the table again, hunched over a plate of half-eaten food, eyes red-rimmed but sharp. He didn't bother with greetings. They're patient, Morty. Patient's worse than desperate. Desperate burns out. Patient just digs deeper. Morty slumped into a chair, rubbing his face with both hands. It's like, every day they're closer. Not physically, but inside me. I don't even know if I'm fighting anymore. I hear them in my head, even when it's quiet. Rick didn't flinch. That's the danger. Belief isn't about what's true. It's about what's repeated. They keep showing up, day after day, until their version of you drowns out your own. And if you're not careful, you'll start playing along. Maybe not because you want to, but because it's easier than suffocating. Morty looked down at his hands. They trembled slightly, the skin along his knuckles pale and dry. He thought of Jessica again, her eyes full of distance, searching for something she couldn't explain. Maybe she had already surrendered to that pull. Maybe she was gone in ways he couldn't reach. The thought hollowed him out. By midday, Morty couldn't stay inside anymore. The air in the house felt heavy, thick with every unsaid word. Against his better judgment, he stepped out onto the porch. The moment the door opened, heads turned, and silence deepened into something more electric, more expectant. They didn't chant, they didn't sing. They simply rose slightly on their knees, as though his presence alone was sacred. Morty's breath hitched. For a moment, the sheer stillness of them made his knees weaken. He wanted to run back inside, but his body rooted itself to the porch. He searched their faces, desperate for one trace of Jessica, though he didn't know whether he wanted to find her there or not. Every pair of eyes that met his seemed to burn with quiet devotion, so unshakable it made his skin crawl. Then a child stood, a boy, no older than Morty had been when all of this began. His clothes were plain, his hands small, and yet he carried himself with a certainty that made the crowd part just enough for him to step forward. He didn't speak, he only lifted a wilted flower and placed it gently on the pavement in front of Morty's porch. The gesture was simple, almost fragile, and yet it carried a weight Morty couldn't name. His throat tightened. He wanted to tell the boy to stop, to take it back, to run home where none of this could touch him, but the words wouldn't come. His lips parted, then closed again, as the boy stepped back into the crowd, his wide eyes still locked on Morty's face. Rick's voice drifted from behind him, low and bitter. See that? That's how it starts, Morty. Not with torches, not with threats, with flowers, with kids, with something that makes you hesitate before you push them away. Next thing you know, you're not just tolerating them, you're protecting them. Morty's chest ached. He wanted to scream, but his voice had gone soft inside him, dulled by exhaustion and confusion. He turned and stumbled back into the house, slamming the door behind him. But even inside, the image of that boy stayed, burned into the backs of his eyelids. The night came heavy. Morty lay on the couch, too restless for bed, listening again to the faint hum of voices outside. Not songs this time, but murmurs. Conversations he couldn't quite make out. They weren't leaving. They were settling in. He felt it with each passing hour. Roots spreading, digging deeper, twining around him in ways he couldn't shake off. The sleep brushed against him in fragments, pulling him into dreams where he stood at the center of an endless crowd, his voice stolen, his face reflected in 1,000 eyes. He woke drenched in sweat, heart hammering, but the whispers outside never faltered, as steady as breath. By dawn, Morty realized the truth he had been avoiding. This wasn't just devotion anymore. It was shaping him, bending him into something he didn't understand. And worse, it wasn't only theirs. Somewhere in the quiet of his chest, a part of him had started to wonder what it would feel like to stop fighting, to let their belief carry him instead of crush him. That thought terrified him more than the crowd itself. The morning light bled pale across the curtains, but Morty didn't move. He lay curled on the couch, his body stiff, his mind grinding between two unbearable truths. The crowd wasn't leaving, and worse than that, they were pulling him closer. Little by little, with every whispered song, every flower, every patient gaze, he could feel their presence pressing through the walls, not with force, but with quiet certainty. It was like water seeping through cracks, filling him without permission. Rick clattered in the kitchen, the sound of bottles shifting against each other. He wasn't trying to be quiet anymore, not pretending that mornings were ordinary. His voice carried into the room, low and unyielding. You're running out of time, Morty. You keep sitting here. They'll shape you into their little miracle, whether you like it or not. You'll blink one day and realize you've been preaching without meaning to. Morty sat up, his hands clawing into his hair. I don't want this. I don't want any of it. His voice cracked, too loud in the stillness. I just wanted it to stop, Rick. I told them the truth. I told them everything. Why isn't it enough? Rick stepped into the doorway, shadows pooling under his eyes. Because truth isn't what they came for. You think they're here for you, but they're not. They're here for themselves. You're just the shape they're pouring it into. The words cut sharp, but Morty couldn't deny them. He remembered the boy with the flower, the look in his eyes. He wasn't worshipping Morty. He was worshipping what Morty represented, something bigger than the boy himself could ever carry. And Morty felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a stone. He spent the afternoon pacing the house, his heart hammering every time he passed a window. The whispers outside shifted in tone, rising and falling like tides, always present, always waiting. He thought about trying to sneak away in the night, to disappear as Rick had suggested, but even imagining it made his throat tighten. Where could he go? The world was too small, and devotion traveled faster than footsteps. By evening, the song returned. Not loud, not triumphant, gentle, steady, haunting. Morty pressed his palms against his ears, but the sound slipped through, threading into his bones. His breath hitched, and for the first time, He felt something break inside him. The resistance he had clung to for so long cracked, leaving a space he didn't know how to fill. He whispered to himself, trembling, maybe it would be easier if I just let it happen. Rick was watching him, always watching, though Morty hadn't noticed. His voice came sharp, almost panicked in its restraint. Don't you dare, Morty. You give in now. You're done. You won't even be you anymore. You'll just be a story they tell each other until you're gone. Morty turned toward him, his face pale, his eyes rimmed with exhaustion. But what if I already am? What if I've been their story this whole time and I just didn't know it? Maybe I was never anything else. The silence that followed was heavier than any chant, any whisper. Rick didn't answer, and that terrified Morty more than if he had. Night dragged its feet across the sky, and Morty found himself at the window again, staring down at the mass of bodies below. They weren't strangers anymore. He knew some of their faces now, had memorized the tilt of their heads, the curve of their hands as they pressed them together in silent reverence. And as much as he hated it, part of him felt tethered to them, bound by something invisible and unshakable. A movement caught his eye. Someone stepping forward. For a breathless moment, Morty thought it might be Jessica, but it wasn't. It was an older woman, her hair streaked with gray, her face lined but gentle. She didn't kneel like the others. She simply stood, her eyes locked on his window, and raised her hand in a slow, deliberate gesture of blessing. Morty's chest tightened. It was the smallest thing, a hand lifted into the night air, and yet it broke him in ways he couldn't explain. He felt the tears sting his eyes, spilling hot down his cheeks. He wanted to scream at her to stop, to tell her she was wrong, that he wasn't what she thought he was. But no sound came, only the quiet recognition that he couldn't stop her. Behind him, Rick's voice cracked, low and raw. You're at the edge, Morty. I can see it. One step, and you're gone. And once you cross it, I can't pull you back. Morty didn't move. He stayed at the window, staring into the sea of devotion below, his breath shallow, his mind unraveling. For the first time, he didn't know if he wanted to be pulled back at all. The night grew colder, and still he stood there, watching, as though waiting for something inevitable to happen. And deep inside him, beneath all the fear and anger and exhaustion, a quiet, terrible thought whispered, maybe it already had. Morty didn't sleep. The hours stretched thin and brittle, each second dragging over him like glass. He stayed by the window long after Rick had disappeared into his cluttered workshop, unable to pull himself away from the sight outside. The people didn't leave. They shifted. Some lying down with their heads on each other's shoulders, some lighting small candles, some humming the same patient tune that threaded endlessly through the night. Their devotion didn't falter. It never faltered. By the time the first blush of dawn crept into the sky, Morty's body ached, his eyelids heavy, but his mind refused to shut down. He thought about the woman who had raised her hand, about the boy with the flower, about all the faces he hadn't asked for, but now carried inside him like ghosts. They were waiting for something, and he no longer knew if resistance was strong enough to hold them back. Rick appeared again, his face unshaven, his hands trembling as he shoved another bottle aside. His voice was low, sharp, more desperate than Morty had ever heard. You've got to make a choice today, Morty. No more standing in the middle. Either you break free, or you get swallowed whole. You can't live in this in-between forever. Morty turned toward him slowly, his throat dry, his voice small. And if I don't want either. Rick barked out a hollow laugh. That's the thing about choice, Morty. You don't get to sit it out. If you do nothing, they'll choose for you. The words sank deep, heavy as lead. Morty wanted to argue, to tell Rick he was wrong, but he couldn't. He knew the truth when he heard it, even if he hated it. His reflection in the window looked pale and unfamiliar, almost like someone else staring back. By midday, the house felt smaller than ever. The air was thick, stifling, pressing down on him until every breath hurt. He tried pacing, tried distracting himself with the clutter. Rick left everywhere, but the low hum outside bled through the walls, no matter where he went. At last, Morty returned to the window, his hands trembling against the glass. The crowd had grown. They filled the street now, spilling into alleys, their faces tilted upward in endless expectation. And then it happened. A ripple moved through them, like the air itself had shifted. Their whispers aligned, their humming deepened, and slowly, almost reverently, they parted. A figure stepped forward. Morty's heart lurched. For a moment he thought it might finally be Jessica, that maybe fate was cruel enough to place her at the center of this nightmare. But it wasn't her. It was a man tall and gaunt, his robe tattered but clean, his eyes burning with a kind of calm fire that made Morty's skin crawl. He didn't kneel, didn't chant. He simply looked up at Morty, his gaze steady, unblinking, unshakable. Rick swore under his breath. That's it. That's the beginning of the end. Morty swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. Who is he? Rick shook his head, bitterness carved into every line of his face. Doesn't matter who he is. What matters is what they think he is. They've been waiting for someone to lead them, Morty, and he's the one who's going to hand them the story you're too scared to tell. The man below lifted his arms, palms open to the sky. The crowd responded like a single body, their voices rising, their chants swelling into something louder than ever before. Morty staggered back from the window, his chest heaving. He could feel it now. The pull, the gravity of belief wrapping around him, threatening to drag him under. Rick grabbed his shoulders, his grip harsh, his voice cutting through the chaos. Listen to me, Morty, this is the moment. You either step out there and take control of it before he does, or you walk away forever and let them bury you under his story. Those are your choices. No more waiting. Morty shook his head violently, tears burning his eyes. I can't. Rick, I can't lead them. I can't walk away. I don't know how to do either. Rick's voice cracked, raw with something Morty had rarely heard from him. Fear. Then you're gonna lose yourself. Do you understand me? You're gonna stop being Morty. You'll just be whatever they say you are. The word shattered something inside him. He collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The sound of the crowd below thundered through the walls, relentless, unstoppable, and deep down, Morty knew Rick was right. The in-between was gone. The choice had come, whether he wanted it or not. As night returned, the figure outside remained at the center of the gathering, his presence a silent challenge. The people looked to him, but their eyes still flicked toward Morty's window, waiting for a sign, for a decision. Morty lay awake again, trembling, the question gnawing at him until it was all that existed. Would he step forward or let himself disappear into the story others were writing for him? The answer didn't come. Not yet, but the weight of it pressed harder than ever. A shadow he couldn't escape. And when he finally closed his eyes, the last thing he saw was the man's gaze, steady and endless, pulling him into a future he couldn't stop. The night seemed endless, thick with voices that refused to fade. Morty sat upright, his body sore from the couch, his mind locked in a loop of fear and uncertainty. He kept glancing toward the window, though each time his chest tightened at the sight of the figure below, still standing at the center of the crowd as if he belonged to something larger than life. The man hadn't moved much, only lifting his hands every so often to quiet the chanting or nod toward someone in the throng, but his presence was undeniable. It pressed against Morty like a weight, demanding acknowledgement, forcing him to feel smaller than he ever had before. Rick hadn't slept either. He slouched at the kitchen table, staring at a bottle without drinking from it, muttering half-sentences that Morty couldn't always catch. Sometimes it sounded like strategy, other times like pure desperation. Morty wanted to ask him for clarity, for comfort, for anything that could make the decision clearer, but he stayed silent. If Rick, with all his brilliance and defiance, couldn't see a way out, then what chance did Morty have? When dawn came again, the chanting softened, but the crowd didn't disperse. They simply shifted, sharing food, resting on each other's shoulders, passing cups of water like pilgrims determined to outlast the very ground they stood on. The figure remained. His stillness was more unsettling than any wild outburst could have been. It was patience, deep and calculated. He wasn't in a rush. He knew time itself was on his side. By mid-morning, Morty's nerves were raw. He couldn't sit still, couldn't breathe right. The silence inside the house felt louder than the noise outside. At last he spoke, his voice trembling. Rick, what if they're not wrong? What if I am supposed to be something to them? Sheriff screeched as he stood abruptly, his eyes blazing. No, Morty. That's exactly what they want you to believe. They don't care about you. They care about the story. They'll shove you into it, carve you down until you fit their script, and you'll disappear. Is that what you want? To stop existing as Morty and start existing as some fake version they invented? Morty flinched, but part of him couldn't let go of the thought, but what if the fake version is stronger than me? What if it survives? Rick slammed his fist against the table, his voice breaking with fury. Surviving isn't living. Do you hear me? You'll be gone, and all that's left will be their puppet. I can't. His voice cracked, softer now, almost pleading. I can't lose you to them, Morty. The words shook him more than anger ever could. Rick, who never admitted weakness, who never begged, was afraid in a way Morty had never seen. That fear was contagious. Morty wanted to run, to hide, but there was no place left untouched by the crowd's reach. That afternoon, the figure finally moved. He stepped closer to the house, each stride deliberate, his robe brushing the dust at his feet. The people parted, silent now, their eyes shining with reverence. He stopped just short of the yard, lifted his head and spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but with a calm that carried through the air. We wait because we believe. We stand because we see the light above us. Come to us, and the burden will no longer be yours alone. You do not have to fear. The words stabbed Morty's chest. They weren't commands. They weren't threats. They were gentle, almost merciful. That made them worse. For a moment, Morty felt his legs move on their own, like something in him was answering a call he didn't understand. Rick's hand shot out, gripping his arm tight. Don't. That's how it starts. One step and you're gone. Morty froze, torn between the grip that held him back and the voice that pulled him forward. He thought of the endless faces outside, the endless expectations. He thought of Rick's trembling hands and desperate eyes, and he thought of himself, the boy caught in the middle, breaking apart piece by piece. Night fell again, and the figure didn't leave. He camped at the edge of the yard, his presence like a fire that wouldn't burn out. The people sang softly, their voices weaving through the dark like a lullaby. Morty lay awake, every sound carving deeper into his mind. Hours stretched into what felt like years. Morty's thoughts grew heavier, sharper, circling one truth he couldn't escape. Tomorrow the choice would come. He could feel it pressing closer, a storm gathering strength. If he hesitated again, it wouldn't matter. The decision would be made for him. Rick didn't speak much that night. He stayed near Morty, pacing, occasionally muttering curses under his breath. But before dawn, when the house was at its quietest, Rick finally stopped and looked directly at him. His voice was low, stripped of all the bravado and sharpness. Morty, whatever you decide tomorrow, I need you to remember one thing. You're not their savior, and you're not their prisoner. You're you. Don't let them steal that. Morty swallowed hard, his chest tight. He wanted to promise, to give Rick the reassurance he craved, but he couldn't. He didn't know if he was strong enough to keep that promise. When the first light of morning touched the window, the figure outside rose again. The crowd stirred, voices ready to swell, hearts ready to follow. The world seemed to hold its breath. Morty's hands shook as he stood, his reflection in the glass almost unrecognizable. The moment had come, and whether he stepped forward or stayed hidden, Morty knew the story would change forever.